Mariette is non-resident fellow at Stanford's Cyber Policy Center and at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. She's a columnist for the Financial Times and serves on a number of not-for-profit boards, as well as on the UN's high-level advisory body on AI. Between 2009 and 2019, she served as a member of the European Parliament, where she worked on trade, foreign and tech policy. She's also the author of The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, which was one of last year's must-read tech books. And she is going to be exploring for us the delicate balance of our age between the good that tech can do for democracy and the dangers of letting self-interested tech giants dominate the field. So please do welcome Mariette Schaake.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Indeed, I'm incredibly sorry not to have made it to Mechelen, but maybe this is the least of the bad options, because otherwise I may have been stuck somewhere in the ring around Antwerp or who knows where. So I hope most of you have been able to make it in person. It's usually the best part of conferences to talk over coffee and to share experiences, create new ideas. And so I'm really sorry to miss that energy and those new ideas, because I think we desperately need them, desperately need solutions at the intersection of tech and civic participation to make our democracy more robust. And I'm really excited to see that TICTeC is making that shift, that my society is so focused on building democratic resilience, because I think it's necessary. And so in this introductory part of my talk, before we go to interaction, I want to focus on what I think are some of the key challenges that also lead to new opportunities if we use them well. Now, my work has been very focused on the outsized role of technology companies and how that erodes and threatens democracy and the rule of law. And so I'll say something more about that. But I first want to sort of mark the moment that we're in, where after the inauguration of Donald Trump for the second time, but also, in light of geopolitical competition, conflict, unfortunately, our minds are with the people in Ukraine, but also definitely in Gaza. We see enormous shifts in geopolitics where technology plays a growing role and democracy is under new threat. And so I think that backdrop and the dramatic changes that we've seen in US politics that really have cascading effects all over the world are leading to unprecedented challenges because of the ongoing threats to democracy that are now being exacerbated by one of the biggest democracies in the world stepping back from its ambitions of strengthening the rules-based order, of respecting checks and balances and constitutional rights at home, and is just less interested in funding civil society, being part of global coalitions, to uphold the principles and rights that in principle were articulated after World War II. Of course, we're never perfect, and we have a lot of concern about, the gap between principle and practice. But to do away with the principles wholesale is actually worse yet. So I think it creates challenges for the transatlantic relation, as we very much feel here in Europe, where we are gathering today. But it has huge ripple effects around the world in terms of even aspiring to want to uphold universal human rights or the rule of law, and to try to even set an example that way. And I'm sure in each of your organizations, you felt it as people of this world, but Americans in particular, you felt it. I see it around me in the academic community. I know the despair in civil society, in the press, and we now see new threats to federalism. The moratorium on state legislation around AI that the Trump administration is trying, the intervention in Los Angeles with the National Guard, real confrontations that get to this erosion of principles and the tectonic shifts that we're seeing that deeply impact democracy and the rule of law and have a special role for technology. And I want to focus on that because that's been the focus of my research and work, previously as a member of European Parliament, now in an academic setting. Because I think it's important that we both appreciate that there's a big struggle between authoritarianism and democracy globally, that this struggle is tangible within our societies, but that there are also new attacks on democracy and the rule of law that come from the role that tech companies play, the enormous power that they have. And of course, this became very clear to everyone who wasn't attuned to it already when we saw Donald Trump being inaugurated for the second time, CEOs of tech companies lining the front rows, and a unique, very, very controversial role being given to Elon Musk. And maybe Elon Musk has made visible this conflict of interest, this bringing to the core of the U.S. state and U.S. politics of tech corporate interests the most clearly. You know, his role as so-called head of the Department of Government Efficiency, for that whole new constellation that is outside of a hearing before Congress, an official mandate, transparency, checks and balances that are typically a part of leading a government department, DOGE not being a government department, but giving Musk and his collaborators access to the core of U.S. government in order to undermine it, to destroy it, or to remake it in the name of efficiency, but of course leading to incredible consequences that happen outside of a rule of law set of principles. And so I think, you know, when I talk to people around the world, for many people who were not yet plugged into the harms of the outsized role of tech companies and how that hurts democracy, seeing Musk at work, seeing those CEOs at the front row of the inauguration made clear what is at stake. Now, even if Musk is now, claiming to take a step back, we'll have to see where that ends. I don't think we've heard the last word about it, but I think the core to keep in mind is that this, even though Musk has made it very visible, it's not so much about Musk. Some of the individuals involved become symbols of what the problem is, but I would encourage everyone to really think about the erosion of democracy because of the outsized power of tech companies as a systemic problem that is not always visible, in fact, is often invisible, is not always blatant, but sometimes gradual. And so I just want to highlight a couple of ways in which we can think about the systemic threat to the rule of law because of the outsized power of tech companies that doesn't get paired with sufficient countervailing powers, independent oversight, and accountability, and that's why it's problematic. And on top of the examples that I want to mention, we have to appreciate the fact that a number of tech leaders, especially those who are now supporting the US administration and Donald Trump and JD Vance, have their own geopolitical agenda. So they're not just there to empower the US administration, but perhaps they see the US administration as a vehicle to realize their own agendas that are anti-democratic, certainly anti-European, and that actually want to replace the way government is organized thus far in the US and in rule of law-based societies with a more corporate system. So the idea is really to take away government institutions, replace them with corporate structures, and see leadership in the hands of a CEO king, so much more centralized, much more catering to similar needs as those that corporations have, which is a very, very different kind of ideology than what we've seen even across a wide spectrum of US administrations in the past. And I think it's important to see how that ideology informs a number of the people who have tied their faith to that of the US administration, which was expected to be controversial, but that apparently was not a deal breaker. But even if those CEOs would not have sat in the front rows, even if Elon Musk would not have been made the head of the Department of Government Efficiency, there are still a number of ways in which tech companies have enormous power and are sidelining or circumventing the mandated and accountable democratic institutions to play their role. And I should say that this has been allowed to happen because of democratic leaders that have abdicated their responsibility. So my criticism is not just towards tech companies and their CEOs, but really also to public officials that have neglected to take on their responsibility to ensure that they kept the agency, the access to information, the governance, and the accountability over the role that tech plays in our societies. And we are now dealing with a sprawling ecosystem of powerful tech companies, large and small, that are challenging the rule of law. So I want to just offer four sort of angles through which we can think about this outsized power that will hopefully offer you a lens through which you can look at all the things that are happening and that sort of makes sense in looking at the relation between tech companies and democratic leaders through the lens of power. And I think that that's really important. So the first example that I want to mention that highlights how tech companies are attracting more power towards themselves, how it can clash with existing laws, democratic principles, is basically because of their control as to when new innovations are placed onto the market. So obviously, it's very normal that tech companies want to innovate, they want to create new products, but by pushing them out onto the market without consideration for democratic principles or fundamental rights, there can be real friction and it can be quite confrontational. So I've spent a lot of time in my life, much more than I ever thought I would, dealing with spyware. And I think spyware, hacking tools, exfiltration technologies are a really good example of that. So just because companies are capable of putting intelligence-grade commercial systems onto the market for whoever wants to buy it, means that there's immediate clash with core democratic principles. So, of course, spyware is typically sold to counter terrorism or fight significant organized crime. But because it proliferates, and this is well documented, it ends up being used in a number of different contexts that are not its original purpose and that have big consequences. So even in Europe, we saw governments using NSO groups, Pegasus suite of products against judges, against opposition leaders, against journalists. I'm talking about countries like Poland, Hungary, but also Greece and Spain. And so just because this technology exists allows governments to buy this commercial intelligence grade technology, and it really clashes with source protection, separation of powers, the freedom of speech, and that is really problematic. Another example that I want to mention is facial recognition technologies and other AI systems that are thrown onto the market, even though it is established that they discriminate, is often referred to as bias. But I think bias is a gentle way of just saying illegal, because discrimination is not allowed in our democratic constitutions. And nevertheless, we see AI systems discriminating over and over again, and still they are being rolled out. So this decisions about when to place something on the market, the de facto power that it gives companies is one way to think about the role of companies in relation to democratic governments. Another way is, of course, sort of, good old market cap. So the dependencies that we all have on tech companies, particularly US ones, when we think about Europe, lead to enormous capital and market cap. And if we just want to try to sort of appreciate what all of that value means, it helps to plot, for example, let's take a company like Microsoft, its market cap against the GDP of countries, just to make it a bit more concrete. If we do that, despite all the stock market fluctuations of the past couple of months, we will see that a company like Microsoft's market cap can be compared to the GDP of somewhere between the economies of Italy and France. And so really, we find the market cap of these companies comparable to the GDP of the top 10 countries in the world. And especially if we take a number of them together, they begin to compare to the GDP of the EU or even China. And so that market cap obviously gives a lot of opportunity to sustain power that has been developed anyway, because a lot of big tech is now big AI. There can be investments in data, in microchips, in hiring talent, in lobbying, in funding, anything from academic research to conferences. So to really sustain that position of power, with new opportunities in a way that's really hard for outsiders to compete with. And it's also clear when we look at diplomatic representation, for example, when I talk to diplomats, they complain that it's hard to be represented in all kinds of fora, EU, UN, OECD, all kinds of, or OECD, all kinds of fora where tech is discussed, where standards are discussed, Council of Europe, ITU, you name the whole list, because they just don't have the people, even significant countries don't. Whereas, of course, companies are there with great and well-prepared teams that have, a clear mission of what they want to do in terms of tech governance. So it has a lot of ripple effects around the world. Then we see a third kind of lens through which we can look at the power of tech companies, that they are increasingly operating in non-transparent ways. So we can clearly see this happening around data centers and access to renewable energy, where it's actually remarkable that a lot of the bidding for the licenses that companies need to build hyperscale data centers, whether it's in the US or in Europe, happens while these companies are hiding behind different identities. So sort of vague names. Like in the Netherlands, we had a bidding for hyperscale in Zeewolde, and the application came from Polder Networks. And so maybe this was a nice name for Dutch people. We have a lot of polders in the Netherlands, but only at the 11th hour did it turn out that we were actually dealing with an application from Meta. And I thought initially, well, maybe this is a one-off, maybe they just think that this is going to work for the Dutch. But if you look at it, a number of tech companies operate this way when they apply for licenses for hyperscale data centers, but also when they buy massive amounts of wind energy, for example. And so when you think about the need to have a public debate, have representatives in city councils, for example, apply oversight over these kinds of applications, even vote on it, then the question is, how democratic is it when we don't have transparency as to who these companies really are? Why not just, do an open application for these licenses? And what's more is that if you look deeper at sort of the details of the applications and the needed information, there's no standard or transparency requirement around the use of electricity, the use of water, and all kinds of claims are being made, often later corrected, that are really hard to have, actual transparency about. And so I think this is another angle, the lack of transparency, the confrontational way in which tech companies operate vis-a-vis democratic legislators and oversight bodies, that just is growing and is just a testimony as to how powerful they feel, how entitled they feel to just challenge or deceive lawmakers. And then lastly, I think it's important to see to what extent tech companies are becoming geopolitical actors with their own geopolitical agendas. We saw this in Ukraine, the grand gesture with which Musk made available Starlink over Ukraine, but then didn't want to do the same over Crimea. We see companies now withdrawing from Ukraine because they're reading what the White House is doing, and they're anticipating that maybe it's just not so popular anymore to help the Ukrainian side. Or we see a company like Palantir, for example, its CEO, Alex Karp, declaring that the company is in the world to help the West. Well, we all know that the West is fracturing. So, it's not so clear what that means beyond that. And this is also explicit. The company wants to support the United States of America, wants its enemies to be scared and occasionally kill people. These sorts of explicit alignments with geopolitical agendas, but also, expressions about the use of violence, as well as, the role that Elon Musk has played with Starlink around the Ukraine war of aggression by Russia, really shows us that tech companies have geopolitical agendas and are increasingly willing to act sort of independent of even the state where they're incorporated to roll those out and to use their tech products as sort of tools in this geopolitical constellation. And so I think of tech companies as new sovereigns because they have so much power to engage in areas that are typically the domain of states. Think also about the rollout of critical infrastructure like undersea data cables, for example, that have a lot of questions around them with regard to safety, security, liability, but also data access that are just not organized properly in international law. And yet this infrastructure is rolled out and will be a target of much more geopolitical conflict. And so we're just seeing all these confrontations between the roles of state, public principles, and international law, and then the needs and the responsibilities of tech companies. So all of this is to say, so much of what's happening and what we see in terms of growing power by tech companies is not happening on the front pages of news. It's not happening explicitly with clear political agendas, tasks, and accountability. It's happening subtly under the radar and in many, many different manifestations. We can add to the list when we think about crypto. We can add to the list when we think about the role of tech companies in our democratic debates and elections. Cybersecurity, the building of infrastructure, scanning it for risk, securing it. The list goes on and on and on. But the point is that we have a systemic challenge to democracy because of the power of tech companies that is just not accompanied with countervailing powers. And this is a problem that I call the tech coup. Now, I want to get to a conclusion so that we have more time for debate. But a couple of things before we do so. One thing to be mindful of is how much of the debate around ethics, human-centered AI, civic tech, and all the things that in principle, are positive and pro-democratic steps to take have also been captured by tech companies. And so we really have to ask ourselves much more, how can we strengthen the rule of law? How can we protect people from abuse of power, whether it's by governments or by companies or a mix of the two? Because we clearly see governments using tech to empower themselves in anti-democratic ways, to shy away from being held accountable, step away from transparency. And so I think it's really important that we also see who is using terminology and what they really mean by it, whose agenda it serves. Second thing to watch as we think about, strategies in this very, very dark moment is that one of the responses also in Europe, but certainly in the US, has been to say we need to deregulate. Now, in the US, I'm not sure what that really means because there has just not been so much tech regulation. But I guess the few efforts that have been there should also now be gone. We see that Trump has annulled the executive order on AI by the Biden administration. Executive order on spyware, for example, is now threatening the states with a moratorium of 10 years on regulating AI. But Europe is also going in this direction, which is actually quite surprising because for the past 5 years, we've seen an ambitious regulatory agenda, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, AI Act, and many more less known rules. And suddenly the name of the game in Brussels is simplification, cutting red tape, deregulation. And nobody wants unnecessary burden from rules, but I think it's important to keep in mind, what is really at stake here, and that there's a very thin line between saying we need to simplify and we are not going to uphold through rigid enforcement the rules that have been democratically adopted, because there would be pressure from the US in light of the trade war, for example. So again, we need to sort of cut through the rhetoric, also from governments, and understand that nobody is in the business of making rules for the sake of it, but that rules are made to protect people's fundamental rights, national security, fairness in the economy. Concepts like transparency, accountability are usually governed by rules. And so it's just too easy to say, ugh, everything is red tape, we need to do away with it. And especially as the pressure is mounting from the US on the EU not to enforce rules that have been adopted, it's important to stay clear of what is actually behind those agendas of deregulation and simplification and how they can be abused. So I think the shift in Europe especially will go in the US as well from any discussion around rules to more investment in infrastructure, in European alternatives when we look at the EU. And I think that also creates a lot of opportunities towards more civic tech, public interest tech, and technology that is actually respecting and strengthening the rule of law and democracy, and that there's a real need for ideas. And so this is where I think your community is crucial, because we can hear everywhere that we need more digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, that we need a Euro stack in Europe. And I think all of this is widely supported, but there is a lack of action to go from where we are today to where we need to be with that sort of big strategic picture as a point on the horizon. And here, concrete ideas, ways in which it can work are very, very welcome. And then lastly, I just want to offer sort of context within which I think a lot of your work will have to take place, which is new and not always comfortable, which is that with a focus on national security. So because of the breaking of the transatlantic relation, all the security concerns that come along with that, and the new geopolitical competition, if not more confrontation, leads to a lot more focus on national security. And in the US and in China, that was already a strong lens through which governments were making decisions, including about policies, including about investments. But in Europe now, there's more focus on national security as well. And so I think on the one hand, that is uncomfortable for people who are very, very focused on civil liberties and protecting freedoms, because, you know, it wouldn't have been the last time that in the name of national security, those will get trampled on. But I think it's also important to start to understand how people who want to ensure democratic tech survives, that there are checks and balances, and that there is transparency and accountability over tech, need to start to formulate their agendas in light of this focus on national security. And so this requires a different shift, I think, in a shift in mindsets and in use of words, in building coalitions, and in developing strategies. But I think if it's done well, it can be used as an opportunity. And that is my last remark, sort of summing this up. We are gathering in a very, very difficult moment for everyone who believes in democracy and the rule of law, and who understands that tech can be a force multiplier for authoritarianism, fascism, repression, violations of human rights, but that it can also be a vehicle for those who want to maintain openness, decentralization, emancipation, empowerment of the unheard voices, strengthening of representation and participation. And I think if we use this moment well, and I say this especially for those of us who are from Europe, there can be a huge momentum created in light of what is being revealed as the outsized power of tech companies and how dangerous it is to do things differently. And so I'm really sorry that I can't sit with you as you strategize or hear the best ideas or the latest solutions, or just sort of feel the temperature as to how you feel with regard to the times that we live in and the opportunities, or maybe just dark clouds that it brings. But these are some remarks that I want to share, and I hope you will feel this moment as one of momentous shift that can also be used to really create incredible new opportunities.
Thank you, Mariette, for that fantastic call to action. I'm going to field some questions from Slido starting off, and if we can bring those up on the screen too, that would be amazing. Fabulous. So I'm going to pull from the top. So Rod Schwartz in the room, thank you so much for the great and clear talk. Given what you outline, it does seem quite hopeless. What do you look to as the genuine sources of hope in what could otherwise be quite a depressing time?
Okay, so I have to do more to not make you feel hopeless. I get it. You know, it's tough, and the challenge is serious, and the power asymmetry between the big tech companies and the rest of us is significant, including democratic governments. But where for years, those of us who've been pointing to the need to actually strengthen the rule of law, to make sure that democratic societies do not get disrupted in crippling ways, were, perhaps, discussing this without much fertile ground. There may have been some people who understood what was at stake, but there was not broad consensus. The uptake of more and more big tech kept on going, et cetera, et cetera. So what I think is different now is that a enormous set of different people in the private sector, in public institutions, in politics, in civil society, are considering what's happening as incredibly urgent, meaning that tech companies are too powerful and that has impact on everything, on defense, on human rights, on education, on healthcare, on elections, on geopolitics, on competitiveness. I mean, everywhere. And so, because it is now so clear to people, it means that momentum opens up to change things. That momentum opens up as well because of the confrontational attitude of the Trump administration vis-a-vis erstwhile allies like us in Europe, but also around the world. I'm thinking about the Canadians specifically here. But of course, the kinds of steps that we see both domestically and internationally are making very clear to people that something dramatic is happening and that business as usual cannot continue. And I think that notion, we cannot go on as we have. We need to do things differently. And actually, the Silicon Valley model is not the ideal that we all should aspire to, is creating a huge momentum. It's creating momentum in Europe to invest in European alternatives, to actually start working towards that digital autonomy much more. But also investors are seeing this, sometimes because they are proud and they just don't want Europe to be treated this way, but also because they see opportunities. Obviously, if the EU is really going to actually make work of its own tech sector, there's huge opportunity also for investors. And I think it's a public secret that a number of the people who were supporting Trump are also massively investing in Europe. So they're probably seeing the writing on the wall. So that's where I think we now have a historic opportunity, but it's a delicate one. Because if you look at the same time at how the hype around AI leads to people wanting to embrace it just for the sake of not missing the boat without doing the kind of critical thinking that's necessary about, what impact would such technology have, not just for the bank accounts of the companies pushing it, but also for society writ large, what needs to happen, where do we have reason for concern around AI, that it discriminates, that it leads to more cybersecurity risks, fraud, disinformation, and whatnot, but also in the long term, who is in charge? Can it be steered while it's unpredictable and ever changing? So many big questions about this technology, and yet the same kind of push towards uptake that we saw with previous waves of new technologies. And I think therefore your voices, people who are sensitive about the need to protect democracy first, and then look at what place technology plays in a democracy, is so important. That there are solutions and alternatives. Um, that there is nothing that's impossible. I think that's another thing to really keep in mind. There's quite a bit of a narrative that says, um, are we already too late to do things differently? So to, have less dependence on commercial tech, and to choose alternatives. And I think that mindset is one that needs to change. And I'm 100% sure that the room that you're sitting in is full of people who know that things can be done differently, and that story needs to be told.
Thank you. Yes, a kind of active hope, I guess, is the answer that we have to be part of. I guess next question on Slido, how can we improve the knowledge and skills of elected politicians when they're dealing with tech?
Well, thank you, because of course they mostly get fed by frames that are pushed by big tech lobbyists that are also funding think tanks and civil society and academic research. And basically, the framing such as regulation stifles innovation is just incredibly successful. Same as now with there are no alternatives, or the hype around AI. It's really hard for anyone, including elected politicians, to find independent sources of information that can just, place all these stakeholder talking points in their proper context. So I think everyone who has the curiosity and the will can do something. by engaging in politics. So becoming a member of one or a number of political parties, looking for the tech chapters within those parties or setting them up if they don't exist, by offering whatever research is done in academia, in civil society groups, or in your organizations, bite size to politicians. I think that's really important. So I uh, worked on this at Stanford, where there's obviously very deep research. Papers can go over 100 pages very easily. No one will read it. And so what we did was make policy briefs that were maybe 3 pages long, that had the key points, and that also pulled out from the research what the 3 or 5 policy questions were that were key. And then, of course, politicians and their staffers can look for more information if they want to, but we are just not assuming that they're going to read 100 pages, which they probably won't. So I think meeting politicians where they are, meaning what are the policy implications here, and not just what are sort of generally interesting developments going on in the world, is really helpful. And if you want to advance some points on behalf of different groups, let's say civil society groups, it always helps to come with as large as possible a group of people or a coalition, because it's simply easier for a representative to feel that they need to make time for a letter signed by, I don't know, 500 organizations or 50 organizations representing however many people, than one individual email with one individual organization's point. So to create mass and to meet politicians where they are, I think is the best advice that I can give you.
Thank you. I'm going to take another question from Slido, and then if we do have a question in the room, please do raise your hand. You can hear, Mariette, from someone other than me that there are other people here as well. So the next question on Slido is about how we as governments, but also civil society, can reduce our dependence on the big tech companies and the big tech stack.
So a couple of things. What I'm dying for someone to do is to map what is already being done in Europe. Because, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago where I talked to a number of people who are from Scandinavia who say, oh, well, there's a massive migration from Microsoft to Linux in Scandinavia. And I was like, oh, cool. But, perhaps people in, I don't know, France and Italy don't know this, right? And I know that cities like Munich, but also Copenhagen, are migrating away from big tech. What did they learn? What worked well? How did they help the alternative scale if that was something that needed support? How can there be manuals for how such a migration takes place, including notions around procurement? So procurement rules are quite stringent for a variety of reasons, and national security or unreliability is one reason to also get out of existing contracts. So, that can help opening up room. So that's one thing that I think would be super helpful. So what is already happening? What can we learn from that? Two, to get to mappings for your organization or your city or your academic institution, school, museum, library, what have you, as to what contracts are there, how can they be phased out, and what alternatives are there to migrate to. So this is not typically something that can happen within a day or two. It needs a bit of a strategy, and you need to bring around the constituents that this is necessary. We're going to do it. It may lead to some re-educating or retraining, but this can be done. Sort of sketch the way for teams that you're working with, because I think for some people, the uncertainty, will everything still work well? Will I understand how to work in a new tech context, etc., may be a bit of a barrier. But I'm finding that a lot of people, even within their organizations, just don't really know what the details of their dependence are. For example, don't know how much money is being spent, and so don't know what budget they really have if they would spend it differently. And so then it seems like this is a question of needing more money, new resources that typically don't exist. And I think it's helpful to then have this mapping to stress test really, what is the risk of this dependence? How can it be, unfortunately, we have to think about this, weaponized? if we think about the US government using tech companies against people that they don't appreciate, whether it's in different countries or different institutions or organizations, sectors dealing with certain themes. And so map, stress test, look for how to migrate, make a plan, communicate to your people, and especially learn from best practices that are already all over the place.
Thanks. I think you've knocked off one of the other questions, which was about learning from each other as we take on this
Oh,
work.
yeah.
Is there a question in the room? Does anyone want to? Right up the back, we have one. If we can get the mic there.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Al Kags. I come from Kenya. I work for the Open Institute. And as I was listening to you, Mariette, I was thinking, we are not all affected the same when you think about it. Europeans or Americans are not affected the same as Africans, or are not impacted the same as Africans because of the fact that Africans don't control anything. They don't have the code. They don't host the data centers. They don't, they're not even on the table in many cases. And when I think of these platforms as sovereigns, you realize that then some people in the world are affected even more than most. So when we have lots of themes that are permeating governments like connect the unconnected and so on and so forth, and we haven't really thought about the terms and conditions that govern that connectedness. I wonder what you'd say about what then can be done in terms of nuance, in terms of how do you respond to these things, so that we don't then do the same mistakes as we have done over the last 20 years, which is that we sit in Belgium and we agree on a direction, and we decide that that direction is 100% the direction that the whole world should take, whereas there are people who will be left behind.
Thank you. That's a great question. And if you ever get to it, I write a full chapter about Kenya in my book. So it's great to have a voice from Kenya here in the room today. You're absolutely right. Of course, the needs and the challenges for people around the world are different. And the challenges around, neo-colonial tendencies in what tech companies are doing, but also what big geopolitical players are doing and how they view a continent like Africa, which in and of itself is very diverse, as you know, are of course problematic in and of itself. Then there are many occasions where governments don't necessarily represent the needs of people. And so whoever gets to decide, even on a domestic level, about the tech infrastructure, rules around it, how it can be an instrument to support the state, for example, can put new challenges on the population, even if it's quote unquote a more local use and solution. So I fully appreciate that. And I think the good news is that when I was working in the high-level advisory body for the UN Secretary General, the appreciation for the needs of people in the global south is and was enormous. But of course, a lot of tech companies are seeing new opportunities to sort of capture those markets very cleverly. So I think that's a space to watch. Looking at it from a different angle, which I think could be a field to explore, is that maybe not having as much legacy use and dependency already can also be an opportunity to sort of do things differently and to, I hate the word leapfrog, but leapfrog. So to make sure that this uptake of anything from AI to ensuring that there's capacity in terms of supercomputing, researchers can have the access and resources that they need to do independent research. Same for civil society. That it's maybe also possible to benefit from the fact that there is not so much incumbency and sort of entanglement with the way things always have been done, positions of power of both companies and governments in the space of tech. So maybe there are also opportunities to directly cater more to what people in local communities want and need, and to design the tech, but also the way in which it's used, the rules around it, more according to their needs.
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Mariette. We are about out of time now, but a huge thanks to you. Please join me in thanking Mariette for that keynote.